Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. If you're a yoga practitioner or teacher who knows that there's more to yoga than poses, but you're wondering where to find that, come join our quiet little party. Here you'll find resources to help you deepen your practice, as well as insightful conversations with yoga, movement, and meditation teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. So we talk about all things gentle yoga, meditation, yin, restorative, yoga therapy, mindfulness, and more. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, it's podcast time. Thank you for choosing to spend some time here today. I have a really interesting episode for you. Today, you're going to be hearing from Kristine Weber, the founder of Subtle Yoga. She is a powerful advocate for therapeutic yoga, and we're going to talk about her work doing government advocacy and interfacing with medical professionals to explain how yoga can benefit way more people, way beyond the mainstream fitness paradigm. This episode touches on important topics like the research on yoga and chronic pain, what kinds of yoga actually help people who are in pain, and whether yoga therapy will one day be covered by health insurance in the US. Before we jump in, I want to say thank you to everyone who has left a rating or review for the podcast on Apple or another platform. It really helps. Those comments and stars mean that the podcast will get put in front of more people on the app as a suggestion. So if you want to help spread the gentle, mindful yoga love, that is a great way to do it. And it's also super helpful when you share your favorite episodes on social media. I love when you tag me on Instagram and I see that someone's shared something. It just I always grab my phone and go show my husband, look, someone shared the podcast. So if you want to make me really happy, you can do that. Or more importantly, if you find a conversation helpful, share it. Maybe send it to a yoga teacher friend who could use some encouragement and validation for the gentle classes they teach. Or you could share today's episode in particular with someone who's experiencing pain and is nervous to try yoga because they have a certain image in their mind of what it is. But above all, thank you for being here. And let's just go ahead and get into this conversation. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. And as usual, I'm really excited to be here today, but I'm especially excited to be talking with our guest today, Kristine Weber. She is a leading authority on the neuroscientific benefits of slow, mindful movement and an advocate for the use of these practices as a solution to the healthcare crisis. So as a yoga therapist and a mindfulness teacher, I'm really interested in what she has to say. She's been doing some important work. In March 2019, she was invited to speak to staff and members of the U.S. Congress at Capitol Hill about the potential benefits of yoga therapy in the healthcare system, which is pretty major. And more recently, she's been involved in representing the yoga therapy field in the national discussion on treating chronic pain. And we're going to talk a bit today about a new report from the CDC, which is the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and what it says about pain and complementary therapies like yoga. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. And Kristine, welcome. Thank you for being here. Would you like to tell us a bit about who you are and what you do with Subtle Yoga?
Sure. So I guess the first thing I would say is my passion is helping mature yoga teachers allow their wisdom to shine, because we live in a culture often that throws away women as we get older, or not necessarily throws us away, but certainly sticks us on the shelf. And actually, the one thing that I love about the yoga profession is that as we get older, we learn more, we become better teachers, and so I think we have an opportunity to push back against that narrative that younger and better, thinner is, younger and thinner is better. Mm-hmm. And actually, mature yoga teachers have a lot to share. So that's the first thing I would say. And then I started teaching yoga in 1995. I got, I started learning yoga in the the 70s. Actually, I had a social studies teacher who taught us yoga club in 6th grade, and it was
Oh,
very old school. Yeah,
that's
it's very
amazing.
it was very hatha yoga, old school. But I remember being a little, I was like a 12-year-old and thinking, wow, I feel different than I have ever felt before in my life. And this is
Hmm.
it. It was weird. I mean, I was having kind of, I guess you could say, mystical or kind of spiritual experiences, and I
Hmm.
didn't have a context for it, because I didn't really understand what yoga was. So that was sort of my introduction to yoga, and I still use some of the things I learned in those classes, which I think is hilarious all these
I
years
think
later.
that's amazing.
But what happened is, I became a teenager. I started having a lot of body image issues, and depression, because I'm a woman who grew up in the United States in the 70s and 80s, and
Mm,
lots and lots of Betty Draper, Midge Maisel kind of pressure to
mm,
to have that kind of extremely thin body, and the value that was placed on women for that. So I developed a nasty case of bulimia,
mm,
and and started going to a therapist, which was super helpful. And I did quite a lot of therapy in college, but it really was returning to my yoga practice when I was 26 or 25 or 26, like really getting into it deeply. I was living in Asia at the time. I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and then I spent quite a long time in India, living in ashrams with sannyasins, more than a year, at that time, in India, Nepal, and actually in Mongolia, believe it or not, where
mm,
one of my teachers was living at the time. And anyway, that at that time, that's when I started to really shift, and start to embrace the path of yoga, from the perspective of a meditation
mhm,
practice, as much as asanas and pranayama. But meditation was really central to the way that I learned yoga at that time, and it changed my life. I mean, it saved my life, really. I think I would either be like on a lot of medication or drinking too much if I hadn't found yoga at that time in my life. So I was always really interested in the mental health and nervous system benefits
mm,
of yoga, as well as the expansive spiritual aspects of the practice. And then when I came back to the United States and started teaching yoga in 1995, that's when the fitness yoga stuff was really picking
mhm.
up steam. So it was interesting and difficult for me to figure out how I fit in that world.
That must have been so dissonant for you to see how yoga was being portrayed and popularized here when you were so fortunate to have this really full experience of like the whole path of yoga and everything that it really is.
It's funny. I remember the first time I went to a yoga class in the United States, when after I'd come back, and so this was like 1995 or 96, and at the end, it was a Jiva Mukti class, which nothing, I don't have nothing
Mhm.
bad to say about that. But at the end of the class, they sort of do these famous neck massages while you're in shavasana,
Oh, where the
and
teacher comes over and sort of
right.
like, okay.
Oh no, they put like scented lotion on their hands and massage, like the whole thing. It was a whole
Okay.
thing. I don't know if it still is, but it was a whole thing back then. And so the teacher came out with a scented lotion on her hands and she's massaging my neck, and I was like, I'm in shavasana. What is happening? I just remember being like, what's going on? And then another class I went to, and the teacher got up in the front of the classroom, and she was wearing like a t-shirt and baggy pants, which is how I learned to do yoga, back in
Mhm.
6th grade, but also when I was in India. And she whips off the t-shirt and the pants, and she's basically like wearing a bikini. And I was like, oh my God, like completely inappropriate by Indian standards. So it was a bit of a shock to my system to come
Oh my
back to
gosh.
that. But then I was like, okay, so this is what's going on in America. Like, can't beat them, join them. I'm going to figure it out. And, I started to like learn how to teach vinyasa flow. It's not rocket science, I could figure it out pretty easily. And I took some workshops and classes and whatever. And then it was in 2003 when I realized, I remember it was a rainy day and I was teaching at the YWCA, and I went in to teach my class, and there were only like 4 people there or something, not a big group. And I said to them, "So what would you like to do today?" And one of the students said, "We want to do what you do at home for your practice." And I was like, "What?"
Oh.
You don't want to do what I do. That's like, boring, and
You want to
that's
lay
not
on the floor and breathe and
right, exactly. I was like, that's not like sexy vinyasa stuff. So I just took them through the class, and at the end of the class, they all looked at me and said, "We want to do that every week." And that's when
Wow.
subtle yoga was born. I was like, "Oh, okay." So I am not teaching gentle yoga. I'm not teaching yin yoga. I'm not which was becoming a thing back then. I'm
Mhm.
not teaching any of that stuff. What I'm teaching, I'm not teaching beginner yoga. I'm teaching
Mhm.
something that's subtle. And so that's how subtle yoga was born. And I really have never looked back. Doesn't mean it's been easy. It has not been
I
easy.
bet it hasn't. From personal experience, I bet it hasn't.
My husband would say, I'd come home and I'd be like, "Oh my God, only 2 people get into my class again." And my husband would go, "You can always get a job at the dollar store." He was like, just like, get over it. It was really
Oh my
funny.
god.
He was like, "Get over it. Like, did you help them?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think we had a good class." And then he was like, "Good.
Yeah.
That's what matters." So he was always my biggest cheerleader. Like, you just got to keep going. And then it was, I started training teachers in
Mhm.
2003, and then 2006 I started my own teacher training program. And that really started to change a lot of things for me. And people asked me to come. I've trained yoga teachers all over the Southeast.
Mhm. And you're
Um,
based in Asheville, North Carolina?
that's right.
Right.
So
Okay.
I did programs in Knoxville and Chattanooga and Huntsville and Charlotte and, Atlanta. I was doing programs
Mhm.
all over the place for years. I did that. And it was about 2017 or so that I was like, okay, I need to go online. And so I took everything online in the middle of 2018, and that's been like the next big shift for me. And the thing that's been so inspiring to me at this point is that so many people resonate with the work, and I think a
Yeah.
lot of that is just that the yoga community in the United States has matured significantly in the past
Starting
10
to,
to
oh my
15 years.
gosh.
Mhm.
Yeah, oh my gosh. I resonate with so many of those points in your journey. And also, I grew up in the country outside of Birmingham, Alabama. My husband grew up largely in Huntsville, Alabama, although his family was from further north. But so when I was first learning yoga circa 1998, all I had were like Gaiam videotapes and books. We didn't really, there weren't classes, and I don't know what they would have looked like if there had been. But so it was a really different world than it is now, where there's tons of yoga on YouTube or there's classes everywhere. But I think even with all of the availability, it's really hard for people to find practices that are suitable for their needs or to even know what they're looking for.
And
Um,
and I would just suggest there's also some real risk to just being like, oh, find a video on YouTube, because there's
mhm.
all sorts of stuff on YouTube that is not necessarily appropriate. There's a class
Oh
called like
gosh.
yoga for back care, and they're doing full back bends. Like, that's not the yoga for back care.
And just
So
because someone has a lot of followers on YouTube does not mean that they're a seasoned and well trained
that
yoga
is very
teacher.
well said.
And what you said about, I'd love to hear more about what a subtle yoga class looks like, because this is really hard with sort of the boxes that we have of like gentle yoga or different styles like restorative or yin or beginners yoga, or explaining to people what it is
Right.
we're offering. And it's, people tend to think that a slower class is automatically gentle or beginner, and I think those are all totally different categories. So I would
I
love to
agree.
hear kind of your take on that.
And I can kick your asana. I don't have any problem doing that, but it's going to be slow. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of benefit to moving slowly. That is from the um, just purely from the myofascia perspective,
Mm.
moving slowly is beneficial. And like from a strength building perspective, moving slowly is beneficial. From a nervous system
Hmm.
perspective, interoceptive awareness, proprioception, It just goes on and on. There's so many benefits to moving slow. So that's kind of the signature of what you're going to get is slow, mindful movement. I was trained in several lineages, including Krishnamacharya via
Mm-hmm.
Desikachar, right? So, and via Gary Kraft. So Gary Kraft was
Mm-hmm.
one of my main teachers, and I'm eternally grateful to him for the understanding that I now have of sequencing, particularly.
Mm.
Before I started studying with Gary like in the early 2000s, but before I started studying with him, you hear about sequencing and it's like, oh, here's the Surya Namaskar A, like, or, make sure you put your supine poses at the end of class. Like, sequencing is actually an incredibly subtle and nuanced
Mm.
art and science that I think a large majority of yoga teachers really have not had the
Mm-hmm.
privilege of being able to go deeply into. But when you understand sequencing and when you understand breath, which is not inhale, take your arms up, when you really understand how to teach breath and how to teach sequencing, you can make extraordinary changes in the nervous system in short
Mm.
periods of time and also over time. And so that's what you're going to get from my classes is a really deep and sophisticated dive, but not
Mm-hmm.
complicated, but sophisticated dive into yourself and into the workings of your nervous system so that you have more agency and you start to understand how you can make those changes that you need. So my classes they vary extraordinarily from if I was teaching a chair yoga class, if I'm teaching classes to mental health professionals, which I've been doing for 13 years, I've been training mental health professionals, or if I'm working at a gym or a yoga studio, my classes are going to look really different, but they are going to be sequenced in a way that's really optimal biomechanically as well as in terms of the nervous system. And I'm going to teach to who's in front of me, so I don't
Mm-hmm.
have this sort of like script like this is a subtle yoga class. It's not like
Mm-hmm.
that. It's much more like, okay, who are we working with here and how
Mm-hmm.
can we develop a sequence that's going to serve the needs of this either person or population.
It's more like a methodology or like a
Exactly.
framework that you can apply to different people based on what their needs are.
Yes, and there's certainly principles of practice that I teach
Mm-hmm.
a lot, and a lot of focus on mental health and resilience. But those are sort of the key things. So I'm not really a fitnessy yogi, although I think yoga is amazing for fitness and it helps me stay fit. But
Mm-hmm.
that to me is the side effect.
Yeah, and it's the problem is when we reduce it down to like that's what it's for, and that it becomes limited by that instead of that being a benefit of the practice.
Yeah, I think being very clear about what your goals are in terms of yoga practice, including meditation practice, because I always
Mm-hmm.
lump meditation under the rubric of yoga.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think being very clear about those goals will help you to figure out what kind of practice you want to engage in.
I love it. And I wanted to talk more about pain and yoga because I saw this report had come out from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and that they've released some new guidance for the medical community on how to treat chronic pain. And my understanding was that in this report that yoga and other complementary modalities were mentioned and that
Yes,
you were involved in drafting a few different responses to the CDC. One was from the International Association of Yoga Therapists.
right.
So you're like the person to give us an overview of what exactly is in this document from the government and
Right.
and then like what it is and why it's mentioning yoga and we can talk about why
Yeah.
yoga might be part of the report.
Well, I should probably start kind of from the beginning of why the guidelines came out.
Yeah.
So it's what happened and what has been happening in our country in the United States for many decades now is an increase in the use of
Hmm.
opioids amongst the population, as well as prescribing opioids by prescribing clinicians, right? So all of this leads to what we all well know is called the opioid crisis,
Hmm.
and the thousands of unnecessary and tragic deaths that
Hmm.
that we've faced from opioid overdoses, including the use of fentanyl, of course. and how fentanyl is, deeply problematic. Right? So anyway, all this stuff was the background, and we're seeing rises every year. We're seeing rises in the numbers of people that are overdosing on opioids, and largely it has to do with this chronic pain issue, right? So in 2016, the CDC released their guideline, and the guideline was for prescribing clinicians. Here's how we want you to prescribe opioids. Unfortunately, in that guideline, first of all, I'd say they gave a strong recommendation to yoga as a first line treatment for chronic pain, which is
Hmm.
extraordinary and really exciting because there's plenty of knowledge in the chronic pain world that movement helps chronic pain, right? There's
Hmm.
plenty of information about that. So it makes sense that yoga would be included in that list. And we have probably from all of the research that's been done on yoga, and there's a lot, but we're looking at approaching 10,000 studies and quite a few systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which are like the high end of the research, right? So there's the strongest evidence we have for yoga's effectiveness across the board is chronic pain. Like that, it
Hmm.
just keeps that's the research that really shines in terms of what yoga can do. It's chronic pain. Okay, so we have that. So it gets put into the 2016 guideline. And the unfortunate fallout of those guidelines is that and the reason I'm calling it guideline and not guidelines is because that's what the CDC calls it. I don't understand, but anyway, that's what they call it. So anyway, the
Interesting.
unfortunate, yeah, so the unfortunate result of that was that many states took these recommendations, didn't bother really reading them or understanding them, but they just implemented them right off the bat. And that meant that a lot of people were getting disenfranchised from appropriate pain medication. For example, African
Mm.
American women having C-sections weren't getting the opioids they needed afterwards. Yeah. I
Oh,
mean, how
okay.
screwed up is that, right?
That's
So,
when you need it. So it was just restricting the prescription of
yeah,
opioids even when they would be appropriate.
even when, yeah,
Okay.
it was really a mess, actually. It is, and
Wow.
it still is. And so the CDC scrambled. And by the way, those first guidelines, like, let's be frank, the reason they came out was to help people to backpedal and not take responsibility for the crisis. Like, that
Uh-huh.
was what was going on.
Yeah.
They were like, no, 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 we have these guidelines. And I'm sorry, like,
So
if
they've
that
been
offends anybody, but it's
over-prescribing
true.
and things were getting out of hand and then they sort of like overcorrect the other way or create another
Yeah,
mess
they
and
were well,
yeah.
and they were trying to, they're trying to pass the buck to some extent. They were trying to be like,
Mhm.
"Hey, this isn't, we didn't do this," and the same thing is happening right now. So, and then you think about what happened. You have these people going to different doctors and getting prescriptions for opioids and then killing themselves. Like that is crazy when you think
Mm.
about it. That kind of medical mishandling it
Mhm.
has been allowed to go on, but what it reflects is a grave misunderstanding of chronic pain by the medical community that
Right.
continues to look at it as if it's a biomedical problem.
Right.
And chronic pain is not. You cannot look at chronic pain strictly through a mechanistic lens. You
Mhm.
have to bring in the biopsycho spiritual aspects of pain.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult for people who've been trained in very mechanistic approaches to the body,
Mhm.
and they see the pill as the answer. It's very difficult. So
Mhm.
I certainly am not trashing the medical profession here. However, what the chronic pain does is points in the direction that of the changes that are necessary across the board, because chronic pain, like depression, like diabetes, like chronic lung disorders, like trauma, has to be addressed from a much broader worldview. And so the
Mhm.
biopsychosocial spiritual model is a much better model. It's starting to be implemented as the gold standard. Nevertheless, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem is going to look like a nail, and you're just going to hammer
Absolutely.
away that chronic pain with opioids.
Mhm. Yeah, I work with, quite a few. I'm a yoga therapist and I work with students who have different chronic conditions or who've had surgeries or who have chronic pain or things like that. And what you start to understand is not just like the sensation of pain, like an unpleasant sensation, but it's an experience that affects every facet of a person's life. And the longer it goes on, the more it affects their role in the world, the activities that they're able to do, the places they're able to go, their mental health, their ability to work. Like, it's such a huge scope of what's affected by chronic pain. So,
Well,
it.
also, I would just add to that statement, which is completely accurate, that the causation or the etiology of chronic pain
Mm,
is equally complicated. So somebody
mm,
doesn't just get chronic pain. There are many, many factors involved in why one person experiences a situation as chronic pain and another doesn't. And
mm-hmm,
much of that has to do with two key things. Do you feel like you have support? You have a supportive community, family. And the second one is, do you have the sense that you have any agency or control over your pain and
mm.
can change it? And if you don't have either of those things, you're going to be ending up with much more chronic pain than people who do have a sense of agency and people who do have a sense of support. And that is very difficult. It's impossible to solve that with a pill.
That's impossible to solve with a pill. Like, it's so much more of a multidimensional
Exactly.
situation. And so, can we dig into the what the biopsychosocial spiritual model is a little bit and kind of break down the components of that? Because I think that's, it's a
Sure.
biopsychosocial spiritual problem.
Sure, sure. So the biomedical model was used in the 20th century and it continues to be used now. It was developed in the 20th century. I think you have to go back to Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes and this whole
Hmm.
split of the body mind in the 1700s, which happened because there was all these like weird and entrenched religious ideas around health, and clearly
Hmm.
something had to change. So the scientific revolution, that comes at that time, like that change, it starts
Hmm.
to change everything, and it's great, and that has to
Hmm.
happen. But
Hmm.
the byproduct of that, the unfortunate byproduct, is that we take out the humanness of the
Hmm.
human being. So in 1970, a guy named George Engel proposed a biopsychosocial model. So he was saying, like, human beings are biological, we're also social creatures, and we have, and we're psychological. We have psychological aspects to ourselves. So in treating any mental health challenge, we must use the biopsychosocial model. And then the biopsychosocial model started to get expanded, and people were looking at like Harold Koenig and Barbara Fredrickson and Corey Keyes were looking at spirituality and health. And there's a
Mm.
whole center for spirituality and health at Duke, and there's another one at Harvard. I think there's one at Stanford. And so these people are studying the benefits of spirituality on health and have found incontrovertible evidence that spirituality benefits health. Lisa Miller at Columbia University. I mean, it's just like so many people out there looking at it. So that started to be added to the biopsychosocial model, and now it's often called biopsychosocial spiritual. Although some people leave the spiritual off, like some
It's
people just
sometimes
don't want to have that
people,
word,
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, people get a little scared by that word, and
they
especially in
do.
institutions and in particular
Exactly, but it
circumstances.
yeah, but then you have people doing these really robust body of research looking at the benefits. So it's hard to deny that those are benefits. Even Corey Keyes did some work. He's at Emory University. I think he's still there, but anyway, he did some work on spirituality and health. And Canada, Canada took his work and implemented it in Manitoba because that's what they do. Like there's mass shooting in America, so Canada changed their gun laws. It's so
Yeah, they learned from our mistakes way better than we do, right?
well, and they also learned from our research, and so they implemented a spirituality and health initiative in Manitoba where they actually have like spiritual counselors who go out and talk to people and make sure in the community, make sure they're leveraging their spirituality for their health. So it's quite, I think it's extraordinary that there's this research out there. And we're living in a time that's increasingly becoming post-religious and more spiritual. And so yoga, like people go,
Hmm.
oh, that might fill the gap for me. And I think it does for many, many people.
Hmm. especially when we're talking about the large umbrella of yoga that's not just asana. It
That's right.
includes meditation and philosophy and self reflection and the
The
spiritual
breathing, yeah.
components. Yeah,
Mhm.
so I think it's interesting as well because in the yoga therapy world, we also relate the BPSS model to a piece of yoga philosophy that's been around forever, which is the five koshas. And it's a model of like this holistic human being and this layer, this sense of layers of what a human is. And I wonder if you have anything to say about that kind of connection that seems to already be there between what yoga is and what in Western science and medicine we're just kind of going, oh, we're figuring this out as if it's new.
So the Western world traditionally, philosophically, has been excellent at exploring the external factors and things like the
Mm,
social determinants of health and
mm-hmm,
early and adverse childhood experiences. Like the Western world, in terms of the theoretical part around health, has been very good at external factors, environmental determinants of health, social determinants of health, all of these things that influence whether or not somebody is healthy, including the locus of control, which is where is the control about your health. And Robert Woods Johnson's put out a study several years ago that showed that up to 70% of your health results, your health outcomes, come from things that you did not have any control over,
hmm,
right? So 70%, which is quite a myth buster, especially in like the yoga world where we think we have control over everything about ourselves, but up to 70%. So it has a lot to do with like, do you have access to sidewalks and, for
mm,
walking and good care? And do you live in a food desert? Do you have, do you have community that supports you? All of that stuff is factoring into your individual health. So
mm-hmm,
the Western world, in terms of theory, in terms of research, has been really good at exploring those issues. What the Eastern world has been very good at is going, okay, so this locus of control is now with the self. What the heck is the self? And so you can take the biopsychosocial spiritual model and you can connect it to the kosha model, which is
mm-hmm,
what I did many years ago. And I use this as a model for teaching.
mm-hmm,
And the being the most external part of yourself is that social part, right? It's the biopsychosocial. And really they should rename the biopsychosocial spiritual model as the spiritual psychobiosocial model, because that would be more appropriate in terms of these deepening locus of control, right? So you get
mm,
the social is the most external, and then you get the psychological, then you get the biological, then the
mm-hmm.
psychological, then the spiritual,
Going
right?
from the
And
outside in.
yes, and so you can take that, you can take the other model that I use a lot is called the social ecological model,
Mm,
which is even more appropriate in some ways, because the social ecological model puts self in the center. And then, going off to the right, you start getting family, institutions,
mm-hmm,
work environments, the cosmos, if you like, everything outside of yourself. And then
mm-hmm,
what the kosha model does is go from the body
mm-hmm,
to the energy body, to the mind, to deeper aspects of the mind,
mm-hmm,
and to the spirit. Well, Anandamaya is the bliss body. So that's kind of like a deeper part of yourself that interfaces with the Atman, right? The deepest sense of self, which is the connection.
mm-hmm,
Atman, deepest sense of the self, is the connection to the Jivatman, is the connection to the Para Atman, or Brahma, so the larger self,
mm-hmm,
right? So the way that I look at it is like, yeah, you take this biopsychosocial or social ecological model and you sort of locate where the locus of control is. And the whole point of yoga practice, in my opinion, is to internalize that locus beyond
mm,
just the everyday mind into deeper and deeper till you get to the Atman, to the self. And
mm-hmm,
that's what's really calling the shots. And your consciousness, your awareness of these deeper parts of the self is the practice of peeling back those layers of the onion to get to the deeper part of the self. And that's what yoga practice potentially can do.
mm. So it can be incredibly empowering for people who are struggling with things like chronic pain when they realize they have some agency and some ability to work with this locus of control, and that it may not just be, what's happening to me externally, but that there's a whole world of like how I can relate to it, how I can care for myself better. And yoga gives us a lot of these kinds of tools. And how, just going back to the CDC report thing for a minute, how significant is it that like a government agency is talking about yoga as a frontline, you know, intervention for something like chronic
Yeah.
pain, which is affecting millions and millions of people?
Yeah, I wrote a couple of blogs about it. So if people want to
Yeah.
go a little deeper, just go to my website and there's some blogs about it. But yeah, I think it's really, really exciting in some way. So I didn't quite finish talking about it. I got to 2016. In
Oh
2022,
yes, yeah.
yeah, in 2022 they redefined the guidelines, and unfortunately the way they redefined this guideline, they call it, is even a little bit more biomechanical than it was in 2016. Yeah,
Huh.
because this is they were trying to be really specific. It's a massive document, by the way, but they were trying to be really specific about how you should prescribe opioids, right? That's what the document's about. And then
Okay.
as an aside, they say things like, "Oh, and maybe you should do some physical therapy." And hey, there's yoga and meditation helps, I mean, so they put those things in there kind of like as a nod to the integrative stuff, which is great.
Okay.
I mean, it's more than I could ask for from that organization, but it doesn't, it leaves a bunch of questions,
Mhm.
including yoga therapy not being a licensed healthcare profession and therefore not
Right.
being reimbursable. So that means, in the United States, that means like, okay, yeah, go do yoga, but
Mhm.
what physician, you have to train the clinicians to teach them how to prescribe yoga, because
Right.
otherwise they're going to say, go do yoga with whoever on YouTube.
Right.
And it's like, that, please don't do that.
That could do as
You
much
need to,
harm as good. And
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So there's a real, so, oh, find a gentle yoga class. Well, that might be okay, but there's plenty of gentle yoga classes. They're going to ask you to do handstands, so like, that's just what we see out there. So it really is a matter of us as a yoga therapy profession, or yoga professionals who are into, there might not be yoga therapists, but yoga professionals that work with these populations, of training the workforce, of educating the workforce. Our education, um, I would say that our task is doing education as much as anything else, and letting
Mm.
people know there's different kinds of yoga, and some
Mhm.
yoga, maybe you don't want to do that for chronic pain. And, you want to, you want to know the teacher and what their perspective is. I mean, I meet so many teachers all the time that their perspective is fitness, and
Mhm.
great. Like, I don't have any problem with that, but I would not send somebody with chronic pain to those teachers.
Right.
So it's, we have a lot of work to do. But
Yeah.
to answer your question, yes, it's quite significant, and I'm very grateful to people like Neil Pearson
Mhm.
and Matthew Taylor, Marlisa Sullivan, and Holger Kramer in Germany. Like, these people are doing great work, and putting out research and helping folks to understand that yoga is serious and there's something more to it than the fitness or even the relaxation stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem that for yoga to be taken seriously, like there's a real disconnect there between, it's getting mentioned in these really high level documents as something that has potential to help people. And then there's a huge disconnect for people who might be like, well, okay, then how do I find that? Or, if I was a person with chronic pain who had never done yoga and I had an image in my head of this mainstream like yoga that looks so strenuous and looks like so fitness oriented, I would be think a lot of people think I can't do that. I
That's
mean, even
exactly
add
right.
chronic pain, like they'd be like, are you crazy? I really can't do that. So,
No,
how do
you're
you,
exactly right. You're exactly right. It's an educational issue.
yeah, I think for the general public, for the medical public, for the yoga community, it's really a challenge.
Yep. I agree. I agree. And there's a lot we have to do around better understanding of chronic pain,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot we have to do about educating the clinicians. And I really believe the best way to do that is to be in touch with the clinicians in your area. If you want to work with chronic pain, if you want to work with depression, if you want to work with, folks with substance use disorders, like there's so much scope for developing relationships and educating the clinicians about what you do and how it's different. And that's
Mm.
been like my mission for many years, is helping yoga teachers get that language right.
That's amazing because that's a challenge as well to learn like to speak the language that would be understood by the medical community and to be
Yep.
able to like open those kinds of doors.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily have to know everything. Obviously, we don't know everything, but we do have to have some really good skill sets around um, you know, around being able to describe what yoga can do. So, for example, one researcher on chronic pain says that yoga has the opposite effect on the brain that chronic pain has.
Hmm.
That's from the National Institute of Health. So I think I have to find the quote, but I think it was Josephine Briggs, I believe. Anyway, that's something you could put in the show notes if you wanted to. But like when you get researchers saying stuff like that, oh, it might have been Catherine Bushnell, actually. Anyway, I can't remember off the top of my head. But when you get researchers saying stuff like that, like yoga has the opposite effect on the brain in terms of neuroplasticity, like, okay,
Mm.
that's great. And let me explain that to, and you also have to know what you're doing, obviously, like, take some courses on yoga for chronic pain. There's plenty
Mm-hmm.
out there, but know what you're doing. But then if you have that skill set, and you can approach clinicians and say, here, this is what I do, you can develop a business, really, a really nice business
Hmm.
pretty effectively, if you know what you're doing and how to reach the clinicians, because
Mm-hmm.
they are desperate for solutions right now.
Hmm. That's so interesting to hear. And I think, another one of the barriers you started to touch on was just, if people are being recommended yoga, they're paying for it out of pocket. And
That's
that
right.
makes it an accessibility challenge financially for many people, especially if we're talking about like one-on-one yoga therapy, which we charge more for that because that's
Right.
a very specialized high touch sort of class situation. So, and you talked about, yoga is not reimbursed by health insurance. Do you think that's in our future? Do you think that's a good idea? I know there's a lot of debate about this.
I think our whole healthcare system needs to be completely dismantled and rebuilt. That there's that, right? But in the
Mm-hmm.
interim, um, there will be some initiative, I'm sure, at some point for yoga therapy. Now, the Yoga Alliance has worked very hard to keep yoga in the fitness box and the
Mm-hmm.
recreation and lifestyle box and wellness, and out of the therapy box. Like, that's their thing. But they're working they're collaborating with the International Association of Yoga Therapists, and they understand that there are people in IAYT. No, it's not like everybody has the same opinion. I mean,
I'm
I've talked
sure.
to many, yeah, I've talked to many yoga therapists who are like, oh my God, no, never. I never want to go back to the healthcare system. People who are like
Hmm.
mental health or physical therapists in their previous,
They've done that.
um, yeah, yeah. And they're just like, but, so I get it. And I frankly, I don't want to work with a healthcare system. My husband's a psychotherapist, and it's a pain in the neck what he has to do, but all that being said, like, if we want yoga to reach more people, we've got two options. We've got one, which is we make the profession become less professional and more voluntary based, and that's
Mm.
happening in lots of places, and that's okay. But how are people supposed to pay to get trained
Mhm.
to become yoga therapists, to learn this highly technical and very
Mhm.
nuanced skill set, and then make a living at it if everything's expected to be by donation? Like,
Right.
it deprofessionalizes us. And not that there's nothing, people get angry at me for saying this sometimes. I'm like, if you want to volunteer, I got a big mouth. So if you want to volunteer, like, go volunteer. Great. Like, I don't have any problem with that. And if we want yoga to be taken seriously as a profession, we have to professionalize it. So there
Yeah.
are plenty of like doctors that go to Doctors Without Borders and do volunteer work. That's great, and they're making $250,000 in their as their salary, so they can do that. But
Mhm.
yoga teachers scraping by on $35,000 a year, how are they supposed to do things?
Yeah.
How are they supposed to do things pro bono? And if in the healthcare system there was a place for yoga therapists to go get a job at a hospital, for example, and make 60 or $80,000 a year, and have a career
Mhm.
and and a profession, eventually I think we have to get to that place.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's two things. One is that the yoga therapists aren't going to be able to have careers, or it's going to just be limited to people who have, you know, uh,
Mhm.
income from other sources. And then
Mhm.
the other piece of it is that the public doesn't get access to the teachings, and the benefits. So
Yeah. Well
it's a
said.
it's a difficult problem. I don't suggest I have all the answers, but I think we have to really think seriously about
Mhm.
this and figure out how it's going to work. I would love it if like the whole healthcare system just went single payer and then it was super easy.
Yep.
That would be great to wait till then, but can we wait? I don't know.
No, we've got the problem now, and it's just exactly what you're saying. Like, um, when I ran a studio, there was a local cancer center that was like a nonprofit, and they wanted to have yoga for cancer patients, and they would contact us to ask for teachers, but it was volunteer. So the teachers they got were like some of our newer training graduates who were, really well trained, but they're new. you know, Conversely, I recently got a new opportunity to teach a yoga for cancer patients class through a hospital near where I live, and it's grant funded. So it's a paid
Great.
opportunity. So they get a yoga therapist with 12 years of experience, a really different level of knowledge. And we're talking about really sensitive populations that really need a skilled professional in front of them if they are going to really get the most out of the practice. So I'm totally with
Yeah.
you.
And when cancer centers or heart centers contact yoga studios, it's a brilliant opportunity for
Hmm.
for the studios to educate them
Hmm.
in the value of their work and show them the research.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and we were very happy to be connected with them, and I don't want it to sound like I think our teachers were underqualified to do what they were doing, but it is a missed opportunity when we're
Right.
asking people to teach a population like that for free.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah, and it
Mhm.
happens a lot, and I think
It does. Yeah.
volunteering is wonderful, but I do my volunteering in other domains where I'm not a professional. I don't do my professional work for free.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do tons of stuff for free. That's all and I always have, but
Mhm.
the way that I look at it from a business perspective, from a professional perspective, is like that anything that I do that's free is going to, like talking to you on this podcast,
Right.
is going to let people know about my
Mhm.
work. And so, there's different ways of looking at how we do things for sure.
That's
But
true. That's very true.
yeah. So but it's all about, like, everybody's got a different business model. I mean, you work out the model that works for you, and and the larger issue here is the professionalization of yoga. And I get people argue with me about it, and they're like, "No, yoga shouldn't be professional." I'm like, "Okay, that's great. Like, I don't mind. I am very entitled to my opinion, as you are to yours." And but I think the main issue there is,
Mhm.
if we want to think about yoga beyond the wellness industry, then which is a great industry, but it tends to be exclusive to people
Mm-hmm.
with disposable income. So if we want to think about it as a public or a population health strategy, which I've written about extensively in a few articles, by the way, like we want to think about it that like that, then we're going to have to talk about it at some point. We have to talk about that
Yeah.
dirty word, licensure.
I agree. Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with teaching yoga for fun or as a hobby or
Sure.
whatever. But but there are those of us who are like dedicating our professional life to it, and it's a challenge. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing those issues forward, and also
Yeah.
for painting a bigger picture of the impact that yoga can have. You
I
know.
think it's exciting that people like the CDC are talking about yoga
Mm-hmm.
and NIH. I mean, that's exciting that they're even talking about it, that they know that there's something to it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, NIH a number of years ago started putting some stuff about yoga, and like all the pictures they had were these like really hypermobile, thin people doing crazy postures. And I wrote them a letter. I was like, you gotta change the images. Like,
Please.
please, we gotta start. And they did. They started. I don't think it was just because of me. I'm sure they got feedback from lots of people. But you know,
Hmm.
like we got to start change. That's I think really important as well to that we bring diversity, equity, and inclusion
Hmm.
principles into everything we do with yoga. That we're showing different kinds of bodies, different kinds of people, you know,
Hmm.
that yoga is for everyone and can really dramatically change your mind, your nervous system, your life. And people don't, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've met who said, oh yeah, I went to yoga once. It wasn't for me because I can't touch my, you know, I can't touch my toes or whatever,
I
you know,
hate
I
hearing
mean,
that.
it's so common
I
though.
know.
So that's something that we need to work on changing too. And
Hmm.
I kind of look at it like, you know, we're going down the road and I live in the mountains. So we're going down the road and a huge boulder falls in the road and like we're here we are yoga professionals and we just have these teeny tiny little hammers and we're chipping away
Yeah.
trying to get that stuff out of the road so we can move forward. But we all have to do it. We all have to chip away.
Yeah. I agree. It takes a concerted effort, and we often feel, I think, like we're all kind of in our own little bubble trying to do it by ourselves, and
Right.
it's a challenge.
Yeah, I started my online Facebook group. It's called the Subtle Yoga Community. I started it, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago. And
Hmm.
it's really turned into this forum where people are not just like asking for, you know, how do I teach for this condition or whatever. Sometimes people ask that, but I try and tell them you should get trained. But so they're not just doing that, but they're really discussing some of these issues over there and having really good conversations about this stuff. And what people tell me all the time about that group is that they feel like they have a sense of community there.
Mm.
Because we keep it really clean, like people are not allowed to beat each other up, and you know,
Hmm.
I mean, figuratively, obviously, but
Yeah,
um,
yeah. To have
you know, we
intense
keep it,
discussions about
yeah.
whatever.
Well, they can have intense discussions, but not, you know, not those kind
It can get
that are
nasty.
awful.
It gets
Yeah,
surprisingly nasty.
it does.
Yeah.
And we have managed to keep that group. I have a great moderator who's a psychiatrist from England, and she's just, and a yoga teacher, but she's been amazing at keeping things really,
Mm.
really on the up and up. So I think that's one thing that COVID really highlighted is that we can have community online if it's authentic. You know, there's a
Yeah.
lot of like not so good community going out there online too.
Hmm.
But I think it's important to find those places. I would invite whoever is listening that's interested to join that group.
So that's a Facebook group. What was it called again?
Yeah, it's called Subtle Yoga Community.
Okay, cool.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for all the education that you're putting out there and all the work you're doing with not only the yoga community but these government agencies and with healthcare providers and just connecting all of those dots because I think it's rare to find someone who has like a real depth of practice. That's so you have such a well-rounded practice and that can connect those dots with these different kinds of institutions and different populations of people. That's not easy.
Well, I think what happened for me was when I started training yoga teachers, there was so much of what some people call like the yoga teacher mills, cranking out the yoga teachers. That was going on a lot in my town, which is
Mm.
quite a small town. It's a very progressive town, but it's small. And so there were these teacher trainings going on that would graduate 30 and 40 people every few months. And
Oh my
I
gosh.
saw that happening. I saw that happening. I started my own teacher training program. I just, rented space. I never owned a studio and I was training teachers. And I was like, I can't ethically train teachers without developing a place, a culture, a milieu where they could teach. And
Hmm.
so I realized like what I have to do as much as anything is advocacy work. And I wanted to do that from from years ago. I started doing it little by little, writing letters and things like that. And then I got elected to the board of the Integrative Health Policy Consortium, which is it's like my dream volunteer work, which is it's not a job, I don't get paid, but it's dream volunteer work. And we are an organization comprised of many different professions, chiropractors and holistic nurses, and there's Reiki people, and there's
Hmm.
naturopathic doctors, and also acupuncturists. And that board, our job is to advocate for integrative health policy in Washington, D.C. So like I'm working on advocating for policy change, and that's something that's just been like it just feels like a miracle that I'm finally getting to do this work that I've been wanting to do for so many years. I've been doing it, but just in little bits and pieces. But now I'm doing it like
Hmm.
I'm doing it, and I feel like that's one of the most important things I'm doing in my life right now, is advocating for the use of yoga in the health and wellness, the health world, the healthcare world, on the federal level. These things are slow. It's a
Yeah.
it's a juggernaut. It takes a
Yeah.
long time to make any change, but I've got patience and time, and I don't have that much time, but I have patience.
I was gonna say you seem pretty busy with all that you're doing. Can't
Not much
imagine
time,
you
but
have a whole excess of time, but you're spending it well.
it's really important to me to do this work. I'm not on my own at all. I have all sorts of people
Hmm.
that I consult with, including the International Association of Yoga Therapists, who asked me to take over that role. So, like, I'm super supported, and feel really excited about the promise of getting yoga to more people.
I love that. And again, just huge appreciation from someone who's in the trenches, to you for doing that kind of work to get our work out there to more
Thank you.
people and for people to really understand the potential of what a yoga practice could bring to their life.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
where could people find out more about you and connect with you and your trainings or your social media? What do you got going on there?
Well, next week I'm doing a free 5-day challenge. It's called Back on Track Home Practice Challenge. And I use the word challenge not like in the context of handstands, but in the context of self care, like and
Which is
nurturing,
a challenge
which is
to
a
commit
challenge.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm doing that next week, and you can find out about that if you get on my newsletter.
Okay.
And all you have to do is go to my website, subtleyoga.com, SUBTLE, subtleyoga.com. Also, I have my Facebook group, Subtle Yoga Community. You can find me on YouTube under Subtle Yoga, Instagram at Subtle Yoga. So, yeah, please follow me on those channels, and you can find out about all my online and in person trainings at my website, too.
Wonderful. Thank you again for having this conversation and opening up the thought of what yoga is and what the future of yoga could look like for practitioners and teachers and our community in general.
And thank you for the work you're doing. We didn't get to talk about meditation, but maybe we can do it next time.
Maybe next time. Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, it's a huge passion.
Yeah,
Hey, thank you so much,
great.
Kristine.
Okay, take care, Addie. Thank you.
So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend and/or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find us that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, live online classes, teacher trainings, and private lessons, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. Thanks so much for listening.